Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Sellgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. A while ago, I interviewed Russ Roberts on his book, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. That book was inspired by Daniel Klein, who convinced Russ Roberts to take a deep dive into the theory of moral sentiments, Adam Smith's first work. Today, on May 26th, 2022, I'm excited to be talking to Dan Klein, a professor of economics at George Mason University and an expert on Adam Smith. We'll be talking about justice, particularly Adam Smith's definition of justice, which has three different types. Justice is a word that we've been hearing a lot these days, as it's often the case in times of great tragedy, but also in the context of more need for social justice. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to talk to you.
What is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Let me try this. We fans of free markets and small government often say that the free market makes us wealthier and more comfortable and safer. Leave me alone and I'll make you rich, is how Deirdre McCloskey and Art Carden put it. And while I think that's true, I think that we give too little mind to other reasons why we're in favor of freedom. And that's because the alternative is the governmentalization of social affairs. And the governmentalization of social affairs not only makes us less wealthy and comfortable, but actually harms us morally and culturally. And so I think we pay too little mind. I think we have a good sense of it. I think we have an intuitive sense of it, but we don't talk about it so much. And even if it's awkward to talk about and even taboo to talk about, I still think we should be aware of it, that maybe the main reason governmentalization sucks is its moral and cultural effects, as opposed to its constraints on wealth and such. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I feel like that would need an entire different podcast to unpack fully. So let's just move on temporarily.
Sure.
Let's go to Smith. My understanding of his concept of justice comes from the theory of moral sentiments, where he argues that justice is a negative virtue. It's the restraint from harming or injuring others. And injustice is the act of making others worse off. So can you unpack that definition of justice and explain what is meant by a negative virtue?
The justice you just described is a justice in Smith. He puts it as abstaining from what is another's, which is a classic formulation. Another way to put it is not messing with other people's stuff. Now, what is other people's stuff? He says the most sacred laws of justice are not messing with your neighbor's person, property, promises due. That is to say, let's say you owe them 10 pounds. And so, you're supposed to fulfill the contract. That's something that's sort of their stuff as well. So those things are what he means when he talks about justice earlier in the book. He's focusing on a type of justice. He later calls that commutative. And so actually that's one of three kinds you get in Smith. He lays out three senses later in the book. And you ask why it's a negative virtue, that is to say, the commutative justice. There's two sides to that. One is that, the precept of commutative justice is don't mess with other people's stuff. That's negative, right? You could lay in bed all day and you would be successfully fulfilling commutative justice, assuming you didn't have to pay the guy back the 10 pounds today, in which case you might have to climb out of bed. But apart from those promises due, which might be bearing on you, you could just lay in bed all day and be very passive, and in that sense negative, and fulfill this kind of not messing with other people's stuff justice. So that's one sense of negative. Another sense of negative, and an important sense for this commutative, is that feedback on your performance is only negative. You get blamed and perhaps whacked if you violate, this justice, if you mess with other people's stuff, but you get no positive feedback. You get no applause or praise for not messing with other people's stuff. In this respect, it's like grammar. In several respects, it's like grammar, which is an analogy Smith uses. Beyond grammar school, when you get your grammar right, you don't get any praise for that. But if you get your grammar wrong, you'll get marked down for that. So the only feedback on your grammar is negative. So that's, like I say, Juliette, that's one of the three actually kinds of justice.
So let's stay with commutative justice. Commutative. Yeah. That's not grammar, but my English.
It's a funny word. I mean, it's, who says commutative? It's a little bit like commuting and commuter. And a commuter travels point to point. And commutative justice is part to part. It's about you and someone else's stuff. Let's say his patio furniture. And did you mess with it? So it's not about the full part to whole, like did you do good to the whole of humankind? It's about very particular things. And so that's a little bit of the intuition behind the word commutative.
So sticking with that, good clarification also. To fully understand this concept of justice, I think you kind of also have to understand beneficence, which is what he calls a positive virtue. Can you lay out what that is for us and explain the relationship between commutative justice and beneficence?
Yeah, they're quite different. Beneficence is another term for the second of the three kinds of justice, and that's distributive justice, making a becoming distribution or use of what is your own. So beneficence, being beneficent towards people you're connected to, is, generally becoming and gets good marks in this distributive justice. Now, don't let the word distributive justice throw you off too much. It's about Juliette making a becoming use of what is Juliette's own. So this is not, he's thinking, about you and your neighbor. It's not a political concept particularly. And it's really very different than the first one, commutative, because first of all, commutative was about your actions with respect to other people's stuff, and in particular, not messing with it. This is about the use you make of your stuff, making a becoming use of what is yours. Becoming, go ahead.
Could you give us an example?
Well, yeah, charity, friendship, hospitality, all of these social virtues are all different, flavors of what is under this very broad heading. You could call it beneficence, or you could call it distributive justice. So, any of these uses you make of your time, your emotion, your sympathy, your resources, to benefit others. And it's beneficence, not if it just benefits others, but if it's from a sort of benevolent impulse. There's all sorts of other things we do that benefit others, like trade and produce in the market. But that is not beneficence. That's beneficial. But beneficence is benefit from a benevolent impulse, okay? So it's really about a virtue and a social connectedness, friendship, kindness, charity, like I say, hospitality. All of these social virtues can kind of fly under the big heading here of beneficence. And it's really the logic is really quite different than commutative justice. Again, it's about, that is to say, beneficence is about making a becoming use of what is your own, as opposed to not messing with what is other people's. That's one of the difference. And you said it's positive. Beneficence is positive. It's actually positive or negative, because you could also be blamed for not being beneficent and not making a becoming use of your own, or making an unbecoming use of your own. So see, just like in writing, you're writing, let's say you write an essay or a story, you fill up the blank page, you could get positive and negative feedback on that in terms of your creativity, the beauty of it. Whereas again, on the grammar side, it was only negative. So here we have positive and negative. It's not that it's just positive, it's positive or negative. But it's in this realm of becoming, which is aesthetic. So here it's much looser about, what we deem becoming and what we deem distributively just. And because it's looser and more open, people's assessments differ and we disagree. And we got to respect that we're going to disagree on those things, because we have, looser senses and different senses of what is beautiful, essentially. Does that help?
Yeah. So what is then the third type of justice?
Okay. The third type is estimative justice. And that's about estimating objects properly. So how do you estimate a poem or a picture? Those are some examples he gives. It could be any object, actually. It could also be an idea. It could also be a public policy or a public policy position, where I think it becomes very important for the wealth of nations and so on. So this is Juliette's estimating an object properly. And here again, we have opinions and senses, discussions, we hope wisdom about how to estimate the object properly, how to value it, how to pursue it or promote it or shun it or, condemn it. And this is different in its logic from the other two. It's certainly very different from commutative justice. It's closer to distributive justice in many respects, and he says so, but it's still different. You see, distributive, let me tell you a couple of reasons why it's different. And that's why you need to realize that there's three. One of the most important things about Smith's tri-layer justice is that you remember that it's three. It's not, don't reduce it to two. It's three. So how is estimative, estimating objects properly, different from distributive? Well, for one thing, distributive is really about you making use of your resources, your time, your attention, your bank account, your social capital, if you like. And that's constrained. You have a budget constraint. I mean, you have very real constraints there. And you are connected to certain people in your life, in your world. And those are sort of the people who compete for your beneficence. Okay. And so you have this very real sense of distributing scarce resources to competing ends of people you're actually connected with. Now, when we estimate a poem or a picture, it's not as though we have some budget constraint of esteem points exactly. It just does, it doesn't feel quite the same. And so that's a difference. Another difference is that, there's so many objects and they keep coming at us. In fact, every idea becomes a new object, that we're kind of constantly, rethinking our estimations of things. And it's not the same sense of distributing. So I'd say that that's different too. There's a real recursivity in estimative justice, in the sense that as soon as you estimate an object, let's say the picture on the wall, you can then turn that estimation of a moment ago, what Juliette said a moment ago, into an object for estimation. And so it's just much, much more expansive. It's generally more intellectual. It's kind of about what you believe and think. And let me also make another very important point about why it's different than distributive. Now, even with distributive justice, those friends who are connected to you, they have a kind of imperfect claim on your attention and kindness. You could even say an imperfect right. Okay, this is an old distinction between perfect rights, which are associated with commutative justice, and imperfect rights. And so you see, with the duties of distributive justice, there is actually sort of a rights bearer on the other side, your friends, okay? But that doesn't apply for a poem or a picture on the wall. We would never say that, the picture on the wall has a certain right to be regarded properly. It's an inanimate object, so that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. So there's really, I feel, a different logic in all three of these. There's some commonality between the second two, but still, I think there's a real difference between all three. And it's good to know which you're talking about when you talk justice, because then you can apply the logic and ask the questions that pertain. So, if it's about estimative justice, it's like, okay, what's the object for estimation? What are we estimating here? Is it an idea? Is it a public policy position? What is it? And what is your estimation? And so then you elaborate that. What is, how do you justify? See, justify. How do you justify your estimation? We can have that conversation, and we're pursuing estimative justice. And if you're doing distributive justice, you could say, okay, what are the social resources you are distributing, and to whom, what is your connection to those people? What are the competing ends that you could otherwise be distributing resources to? So it's a different logic in each case. And for commutative, it's, are you messing with someone's stuff? I really think it's good to get acquainted with all three and try to think, like, which one am I doing when I'm talking justice or doing justice?
So estimative justice of all of them is probably the hardest for me to wrap my head around, and I would guess for most people. So what is the significance of estimative justice? It's the perception of something, and obviously when it comes to something like policy, you can see how that matters, but what are the implications, and is their duty involved with that?
It's about responsibility in your beliefs and, in your pronouncements about these objects and estimations of these objects. In some sense, you don't, really need to use the word justice in this connection. You could talk about true and so on, good, other words, but that's how ethics is. These words kind of run together and are siblings and stuff. It when you say, like, you don't do, let's say someone's advocating liberalization of, let's say, organ payments, like liberalizing the kidney market, and someone, let's say, condemns it, and defends the prohibition. You might say that the person's not doing justice to the idea of liberalization, that they're misestimating these different competing policy positions. You don't need, especially necessarily, to use the word justice in those connections. You can certainly avoid it. In a way, one of the interesting things about Smith, when he talks about estimative justice, is the way he does so. That is to say, when he speaks of something as being just or unjust in this estimative justice, he generally says so in a kind of mild way, in a kind of I'm offering an opinion way. so one thing you pick up in Smith is that he's kind of like mild. He's calm when he's talking about different estimations of policy positions. You could say policy opinions. I should say, however, that when a policy violates commutative justice, in other words, it restricts people's liberty, he can be emphatic then. But that's sort of on the grounds of commutative justice, where he's sort of pounding the fist, saying that it's wrong to prevent people from locating, let's say, in the towns that they choose to live in because of the settlement acts, say. So he can be emphatic sometimes on policy positions, but it's when he's objecting to restrictions on liberty. So I see that as more based in commutative justice. When it's more just a broader estimative justice, like when he talks about schooling policy, for example, he's very mild. So, is this important? I think it is a kind of important. You see, for these looser notions of justice, we should learn to talk about them a certain way, a kind of proffering coolly. Cool. He talks about the cool hours and being cool in your judgments. And that, I think, is a lesson that, some of the social justice people need to learn, that they're very emphatic. They're sort of poaching the strong emotion of commutative justice and appropriating that for their opinions, on estimative justice, say, for their policy views. And they act like, oh, if you don't agree with me, you're practically, pro-slavery, or you're like violating, you're messing with people's stuff. So see, there's different ways to talk about these different kinds of justices. We feel very strongly about commutative justice, and let's just say between neighbors, between jural equals, like you and your friends, you and your neighbors, you and your coworkers. If you mess with each other's stuff, we feel very, very strongly about that, and for good reason. It's like violating grammar. It's outrageous. And if a lot of people did it, like, the society would be in a real mess. So we have strong emotions attached to that. And then people who want to invoke justice for their policy opinions, which I see as primarily becoming about estimative justice, they often, like I say, sort of poach the ardor or the vehemence associated with commutative justice for their estimative justice. And that's a very inappropriate thing to do. It's bad manners. It's uncivil, I would say, and it's counterproductive in the political culture and at large. It shuts down discussion and dissent and mutual respect and all those good things. So you see, there's a lot of different sides to this, I think, that are quite enriching, really.
Okay, so let's go into social justice a bit, starting with a criticism of Smith's justice. Often he's been criticized as having a conception of justice that is quite thin, which, now hearing all of this and hearing all of this earlier, I think these people are confused. But how do you respond to that?
Right. Okay. Was Smith thin on justice? A lot of people who read him not thoroughly and not enough times do come away thinking that he's got a thin notion of justice, in particular, that he flattens justice down to commutative justice. And I have to say, Smith especially gives this impression when he first talks about justice in Part in part 2 of TMS. And he just calls commutative justice there justice. He just acts like justice simpliciter, like just the word justice. You don't need any modifier in front of it, because as if it's the only meaning. And that he's just misleading there. And you might say, well, why is he being misleading there? Because he comes back later and he does all three, and he affirms all three. And furthermore, when you look throughout all of his work, he pervasively talks the other two as well. So there's abundant examples of him using the word justice or just or unjust in the distributive sense and in the estimative sense. So it's not as though he's saying, hey, when you talk justice, mean just commutative, because he himself does not follow that rule. Okay. So there is this kind of odd thing that he leads you at first into thinking that he does have a thin notion of justice, but in fact, he does not. He absolutely does not. And so people who think he has a thin notion, they would be right to criticize him for that if he did. I mean, I do think you need more than commutative justice. Absolutely. So that's a proper impulse. Why do you need more? Well, one way to think about it is, suppose you want to propound or instill a strong allegiance to commutative justice. What's the justification for that? I mean, it's not commutative justice is the justification for an allegiance to commutative justice. You've got to go to a bigger thing, larger, deeper grounds. It's not a self-justifying thing. And furthermore, another way to think about it is that Smith himself makes exceptions to commutative justice in the area of public policy. He makes exceptions to the liberty principle. So what would justify those? He's actually violating, endorsing the institutionalization of violations of commutative justice. For example, when he says we should ban small denomination notes issued by banks. So that's a violation of commutative justice. He even says so in effect. But how do you justify that? Again, you have to go to bigger notions of justice. So you do need more than commutative, but it's a mistake to say, flattening it down to commutative, that's inadequate. We have to go beyond that. And so instead of one, we're going to have two. And this second one, well, what are we going to call it? Maybe we'll call it social justice or general justice, whatever. And I'm saying, actually, you've got to jump from 1 to 3, all three, because those other two are different and worth keeping distinct and understanding the differences and figuring out what you're talking about and applying them, properly.
Often, so thinking about the objections, they often refer to, I'm going to say this right, commutative, there we go, justice. Yep. But then it moves from, so that's a thin definition, to enforcing beneficence or distributive justice. And is that, I don't know, would that take away from the fact that it is just?
So let's say we're talking about the government, let's say taxing and redistributing wealth. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, first of all, that might be estimatively just. We shouldn't foreclose that. And Smith, wasn't a libertarian anarchist, and it's the real world, and it's complicated and all sorts of things. And so, first of all, you have to say, sure, that might be an appropriate thing to do. That's up for discussion in estimative justice. It would violate commutative justice. Taxation is a violation of commutative justice. Now, one thing I would add is that it's not actually effectuating beneficence. I mean, beneficence is not just paying your taxes. It's no longer beneficence. Again, beneficence is benefit rendered from a benevolent impulse, charity, kindness, friendship, generosity. And paying your taxes, under the threat of being punished for not paying your taxes, that's not beneficence. So while it might redistribute resources in a way that's nice from the point of view of a beholder of the whole of society, the impartial spectator, it's not beneficence. You're not actually bringing on beneficence. Right. So, yeah, it could be worthwhile. And he makes his exceptions clearly. And you'd parse it by saying it is a violation of commutative justice. It's a violation, institutionalized, open violation. It's not like a criminal sneaking around in the night. It's by the jural superior, the governor, the ruler, the sovereign. And it's a violation of commutative justice. Maybe it's estimatively just, and that's what the conversations, are about. I think, generally speaking, he's not much of a fan of the government doing that at all. I think the left Smithians vastly overplay their hand on that matter and similar matters. But, that's part of the conversation around Smith.
So then where exactly does the government fit into all of this? When is the use of force by government justified? And how do we determine not only what Smith means or intends as proper, but what's good for our society using these three types of justice?
These three types of justice don't really answer those questions per se. Benjamin Franklin, writing as Poor Richard, had a saying, an empty bag does not stand upright. Now, these formulations that I'm laying out, and that Smith lays out, these are like an empty bag. It's a way of organizing and separating, the conversation. So but then there's like, what's in the bag? Like what are our judgments? And that's that doesn't follow from just, defining estimative justice. I mean, that's for our judgment and for our sensibilities, our experiences in the world, and I don't think it's really foundationalist. I don't think there's, first principles that are self-evident that just know somehow apodictically, which you then derive conclusions from. That's not Smith's flavor at all. So that's just the conversation, Juliette. And that's why, you read 900 pages of The Wealth of Nations to see what he thinks about all these different things. So what does he think about government? First of all, although he does say you need, in passing, very briefly, you need government to prevent a kind of chaos of people taking justice into their own hands. And I suppose he meant that. By and large, he just presupposes government. He more says, look, we have government. And I think he felt that wasn't a bad thing, in the sense that the only way we were going to get a large, extensive society operating with sort of general peace was going to be in a nation state with an integrated jural system, an integrated system of law and governance in the modern nation state. And he wanted that to be more liberal rather than less liberal. It wasn't sort of like so much about justifying government versus not having government. I don't think it was more about constraining government and making it less troublesome given that we could have a kind of functional and stable polity, which I think, he felt was super important, and I think is super important. And his general view on this, good government question is not destinational. It's not, I mean, he kind of talks, I guess you could say in some passages that way, but generally speaking, I really don't think it's destinational, like he's defining what the exact proper role of government is and what the just society looks like. He's got more of a sense of practical politics, I would say. We're in a time and place. Our conversations are always situated. Our politics are always situated. And it's kind of a question of which direction to go in. And he's generally in favor of the liberal plan, allowing every man to pursue his own interest, his own way. It's not about it being always the case and never making an exception and getting to some destinational utopia. But it's moving and supporting that direction. I would say in a kind of practical way, really.
So how should I and my listeners, how should we apply Smith's different types of justice to our own lives?
Okay. Yeah. Well, just in terms of your, private lives, you and your neighbor, you and your friends, never mind politics yet. Yeah. Well, first of all, the precepts of commutative justice are very, strong and important. So you should not mess with other people's stuff, and you should keep your promises, and so on. So that's very important. I think we all kind of know that, but sometimes we get a little lax, and so we should feel very strongly about that. We should also frown on our friends who forget that. And then you can think about all of the different kinds of beneficence and what your responsibilities or duties are to different, people you're connected to, as he puts it, where it's appropriate to help and how you do that. Distributive justice, making a becoming use of what is your own. That's not to say you're not. It's not. Don't let it feel so oppressive. Like, oh, I'm always supposed to be helping the whole of society, advancing the whole of society, and so, that leaves no time for me. That doesn't follow at all in Smith, because you are part of the whole, and taking care of yourself is, that's prudence. That's important too. And that's also serving the whole, because again, you're part of the whole. And Smith will tell you, look, you are not better able to help parts of this world better than you can help your own parts, because that's where you have the most knowledge and control over how things turn out. It's also where no one else is better than you at doing it. So there's a lot of moral authorization in Smith to focus on, the interests very close to you, close to home. Well, so that's some thoughts. And then estimative justice is, it's again, thinking about different objects and what are just beliefs, just, if you like, evaluations or estimations of these different objects, their importance, how serious to take them, to pursue them, and so on. And then when you get to politics, again, I think you should notice when policies violate liberty or commutative justice. But otherwise, you have these conversations about estimating these different policy views. That's kind of like from the perspective of the governor, as if you were advising the governor on what policy should be. So that's a little different than just, you and your neighbor interacting. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much. I wish we had more time to look at all of this, but we only have time for one more question.
Yep.
So what is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
I later developed a view about religion that I didn't previously particularly think or feel. So it wasn't as though necessarily I thought the opposite earlier, but I now believe quite strongly that ethics, properly done, is patterned after benevolent monotheism. And I actually think that people who are brought up theistically have, in some sense, better intuitions about how to do ethics and how to be ethical than people who aren't. I also generally think that benevolent monotheism, in particular Christianity, made liberalism possible. This is along the lines of Larry Siedentop's book. And so generally I've become like much more of a Christian hugger and generally favorable to religion, even though I do not consider myself theistic. I'd call myself agnostic. So that's something that developed late. Definitely I did not feel earlier. And in the last, 10 years, say, especially, I've developed. Smith's whole ethics are very much patterned after benevolent monotheism. The impartial spectator, in the highest sense of the term, is like God, is a lot like God in many important respects.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.